Appearance of the handbag in all three societies can be considered evidence of the natural mixing of ancient Middle Eastern civilization. For over a century, archaeologists overlooked one detail hiding inside the internet's most famous ancient alien image, and it just rewrote the Sumerian handbag mystery. The exact same rigid-handled object appears carved into an Assyrian god's fist, into a Turkish pillar 11,000 years old, and into a Mexican serpent monument on 3 continents that supposedly never had contact. Millions believe it's proof of a lost global civilization, or visitors from beyond the sky. But scientists have now confirmed what this object actually is, and the proof was never buried. An ancient Sumerian might be bewildered by just about everything in your 21st century home, except that is a handbag. It was carved in the god's other hand the entire time, the palace at Nimrod. Walk into the ruins of a city the ancient world called Kalho. Modern maps mark it as Nimrud on the banks of the Tigris in northern Iraq. Nearly 3,000 years ago, this was the beating administrative heart of the Neo-Syrian Empire. And at its center stood the palace of King Ashurnal II, who ruled roughly from 883 to 859 BCE. He was a builder as much as a conqueror, and the palace he raised was engineered to overwhelm. The walls of his throne room ran floor to eye level and beyond with enormous slabs of pale gypsum, carved in low relief and once painted in colors long faded from the stone. These weren't decoration. They were a statement of raw power aimed at every ambassador, tribute bearer, and trembling supplicant marched into the king's presence. And standing among the hunting scenes and battle scenes, repeated again and again down the length of the hall like a rhythm, are figures that are not quite human. Broad-shouldered, muscular, dressed in fringed robes and heavy bracelets with enormous feathered wings rising from their backs. Some were the heads of men crowned in the horned cap of divinity. Others were the heads of birds of prey, hooked beaks, round staring eyes fixed on nothing and everything. These beings had a name, the Apkallu, primordial sages of Mesopotamian tradition, half-divine figures of immense wisdom said to have brought the arts of civilization to humankind before the Great Flood. On these walls, they serve as guardians and purifiers standing around the king like a wall of holiness. And in the hand of one of these winged sages, held at his side with easy practiced familiarity, is the object. Begin our journey in Turkey at the ruins of the Göbekli Tepe, one of the oldest known Middle Eastern settlements built circa the 9th century BC. The handbag symbol appears on the unique Pillar 43, a vessel with a squared body and a stiff arched handle rising above it, held the way you'd carry a bag through an airport terminal today. That single visual coincidence, a 30,000-year-old Assyrian spirit appearing to hold a designer tote, is the exact hook that has launched 1,000 viral videos because the mind can't help itself. You see a bag, your brain files it as a bag. And once it's a bag, the question writes itself. What is a god doing carrying luggage? And what did he pack? But don't look at that hand. Look at what the same figure is doing with the other one because it's holding something, too. And almost nobody ever notices it. Raised to chest height is a small object shaped like a pine cone. And it isn't just being held. It's being extended, aimed, offered, usually toward a stylized tree of interlaced branches scholars call the sacred tree, sometimes toward the king himself. Hold that pairing in your mind. We are coming back to it because it is the single detail that unravels this entire mystery. Look closer at the robes these figures wear, because even the clothing was carved with obsessive precision. Layers of fringe stacked one over another. Tassels hanging in perfectly even rows. Bracelets carved thick enough to cast their own shadow in the relief. Whoever commissioned this room wanted every visitor right down to the lowest-ranking scribe trailing behind an ambassador to register on some half-conscious level that these were not ordinary soldiers or servants standing guard. They were something else entirely, dressed the way you would dress a being who existed to be looked at and feared in equal measure. For now, keep walking because the throne room at Nimrod wasn't one carving. It was a procession of them, wall after wall, the winged figures repeating like a heartbeat. When Austin Henry Leard first tunneled into the buried mound at Nimrod in the 1840s, working by candlelight through narrow trenches cut along the base of the walls, The scale of what he was uncovering was almost impossible to communicate back to Europe. Entire slabs taller than a man were hauled overland and shipped down the Tigris and around the coast of Arabia to London, where they arrived at the British Museum to crowds who had never imagined anything like them. Winged, bearded giants staring out of the ancient world with an intensity that 19th-century viewers raised on classical statues with idealized, untroubled faces found genuinely unsettling. They weren't just finding art. They were rediscovering the exact route a foreign dignitary would have walked nearly 3,000 years earlier. Past guardian after guardian, each one carved at a scale meant to make a grown man feel small. Every visitor had to walk that gauntlet before ever reaching the man on the throne. Further to the southeast, the remains of the once glorious kingdom of Assyria can be found in parts of modern-day Turkey, Syria, Iraq, and Iran. The message wasn't subtle. You are entering a space protected by beings older than your grandfather's grandfather. Behave accordingly. Ashurpal II spent roughly a quarter-century doing two things obsessively: waging brutal, methodical war and building. He moved his capital to Nimrud and raised a palace so vast that its opening was celebrated by his own inscriptions, with a feast said to have fed tens of thousands of guests over 10 days. The winged sages on those walls weren't decoration in the way we might hang a painting. They were function working every hour of every day, whether anyone stood in the room or not. Clustered at doorways, at thresholds, at the exact points where the Mesopotamian imagination believed evil was most likely to slip through. Beneath some of those same thresholds, excavators later found small clay and bronze figurines of these very guardians, deliberately buried, facing outward, standing eternal watch from underground. This wasn't art hung for appreciation. It was infrastructure built to do a specific, unglamorous, unending job. Their arrangement above ground was a spell written in stone, and the object in the left hand paired with the cone in the right was the tool that spell ran on. Every part of the palace played into the same design. Narrow doorways forced visitors to pass single file beneath carved lintels. Long corridors were built to slow a delegation's approach, giving the guardians time to do their work on anyone walking through. Even the throne itself sat raised on a low platform, positioned so that the last guardian figure a visitor passed stood directly in his eye line just before the king came into view. The final image burned into memory before the actual audience even began. None of this reads as accident. It reads as design built by people who understood with real sophistication how architecture and image together could shape what a human being felt walking through a room. The Assyrians didn't carve things by accident. They carved what they believe kept them alive. That's the fact that gives this mystery its teeth, because the shape doesn't drift. Across panel after panel, across decades of carving, across different sculptures working different slabs in different rooms of the palace, the squared body and the arched handle stay almost identical every single time. The same proportions, the same subtle taper at the base, the same angle of the handle's arc. Someone enforced that consistency. Someone trained the sculptors to get it right. Panel after panel, room after room. And when people care that much about getting a shape correct for that long across that much labor, you are looking at something loaded with meaning, heavy enough that a mistake would matter. 11,000 years before Assyria now widen the lens, because the shape does not stay politely inside one palace or even inside Mesopotamia. Around the 7th century BC, Assyrian societies lived in the Mesopotamian river valley. Travel roughly 500 m northwest into the hills of what is now southeastern Turkey, and you reach a site that has quietly rewritten large parts of what we thought we knew about the human story. Go BC. The oldest layers date to around 9,600 BCE. Not 9,600 years ago, but roughly 11 to 12,000 years before the present. This place was raised by people with no cities, no writing, no metal, no wheel, and quite possibly no farming yet. Hunter-gatherers hauled multi-tonon limestone pillars upright, arranged them into great stone rings, and carved them with animals so vivid they seem ready to move. The pillars themselves are strange before you even reach the carvings. Many are T-shaped. Some scholars believe deliberately stylized into the shape of standing human figures. Arms carved in low relief along the sides, hands meeting at the front as though the stone itself were a body watching over the enclosure it stands within. The site was excavated for years by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, who became convinced that what he was digging into wasn't a settlement at all, but something closer to a sanctuary, a gathering place built and rebuilt by scattered hunting bands who otherwise left almost no permanent architecture behind anywhere else. Strangest of all, the enclosures appear to have been deliberately buried under tons of packed rubble sometime in antiquity, not lost to time by accident, but entombed on purpose, as though whoever used them last wanted them sealed rather than simply abandoned. When the site's true age was finally confirmed, it forced a genuine reckoning across the field. Monumental architecture, organized labor, and complex symbolic thought all existed before agriculture, not after it. Appending a model of human development that had stood for generations on one pillar cataloged as Pillar 43 and sometimes called the Vulture Stone, the carvings crowded together in a dense composition. Vultures with outstretched wings, a scorpion with its tail curled, snakes, birds, shapes still debated. And near the top, arranged in a neat row, sit three small figures, three squared shapes, each topped with a curved line arching over the body. Three handbags, or three things that, to an eye trained on that Assyrian relief, look unmistakably like the same object carved roughly 7,000 years before Ashurpal II was ever born. Feel that gap, because it is the engine of this entire mystery. 7,000 years. The distance in time between Göbekli Tepe and the Assyrian palaces is greater than the distance between the Assyrian palaces and us. Right now, appearance of the handbag in all three societies can be considered evidence of the natural mixing of ancient Middle Eastern civilization. When those Turkish pillars were raised, the Sumerians did not exist. The pyramids would not be built for another 5,000 or 6,000 years. There was no empire, no scribe, no clay tablet, no road down which any Mesopotamian idea could travel backward through time to reach these hunters. And yet there they are, three handbag shapes sitting above a parade of vultures and scorpions, staring out of the deep past and asking the obvious, unavoidable question. How does the same object appear at both ends of a 7,000-year silence with an ocean away? The shape had one more journey to make, and this one crossed an ocean. The next place it appears isn't anywhere near the Near East. It's in the humid lowlands of what is now the Mexican state of Tabasco at a site called La Venta, a center of the Alm, the culture archaeologists often call the mother civilization of Mesoamerica. This was the culture that carved the colossal basalt heads, nearly 10 foot tall in some cases. Each one an individual portrait with its own helmet, its own expression, hauled from quarries dozens of miles away without wheels or draft animals. La Venta flourished roughly between 1,200 and 400 BC, placing it in part in the same broad window as the Assyrian palaces on the far side of the world. At the center of the site stood a great earthen pyramid ringed by plazas and buried offerings, caches of polished jade celts, mosaic pavements shaped like stylized jaguar faces, and imported stone hauled in from sources dozens of miles away. All of it deliberately interred rather than displayed, buried as gifts to something the Alm never wrote down an explanation for. Their art is dominated by a recurring hybrid figure blending human and jaguar features, a motif so persistent across mech sites that generations of archaeologists have simply come to call it the were-jaguar without full agreement on what it actually meant to the people who carved it. Among the stones themech left behind is one that stops the handbag hunter cold. Some suspect it's a simple basket, while others believe it represents the cosmos. Monument 19, a rectangular slab carved with a seated human figure. An enormous serpent coiling behind and around him until its open mouth arches over his head like a canopy. It's widely considered one of the earliest known representations of a feathered or plumed serpent in Mesoamerican art, an image that would echo forward for 2,000 years into the mythology of the Maya and the Aztec. The figure sits calmly inside that frame, one hand raised, the other resting at his side. And in that resting hand, gripped by a rigid handle curving over a squared body, is the same silhouette the winged sage carries at Nimrod. The same silhouette that sits in a row of 3 above the vultures at Göbekli. Here it is again on a continent that by every accepted account had no contact with the ancient Near East whatsoever. Ravenna sits roughly 7,500 miles from Nimrod. Between them, an ocean, sometimes two, mountain ranges, deserts, and thousands of years of separately developing societies that never, as far as mainstream scholarship can tell, exchanged a single word or a single trade good. There's no fleet we know of carrying sculpture to Assyria. No Mesopotamian tablet mentions the far side of the Atlantic. And yet the object in the alm figure's hand and the object in the Aquilah's hand are to the untrained eye, and to plenty of trained ones the same thing. Two peoples who could not have met carving the same tool held in the same grip. What makes Monument 19 hit differently than a passing resemblance is the company it keeps. This isn't a stray doodle in the margins of an unrelated scene. It's a deliberate composition, a seated figure of clear importance, framed by one of the most powerful symbols in the entire repertoire, holding an object carved with the same care given to the serpent coiling above him. Whoever commissioned this monument thought the object in that hand belonged in the scene next to the sacred serpent at the same level of significance. That's the detail that makes the comparison to Nimrod feel less like pattern matching and more like something worth actually investigating. Line those three images up: Turkey, Iraq, Mexico. And the pattern stops feeling like a curiosity. It starts feeling like a message. The pattern spreads. Once your eye is tuned to that shape, it starts finding it everywhere. Mari oral tradition preserves the story of Tawaki, a hero who ascends into the heavens and returns carrying 3 baskets of sacred knowledge. 3 vessels echoing those 3 shapes lined up on the Turkish pillar. Ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs include a sign shaped like a squared enclosure with a domed handle read by scholars as the dwelling place of a god's home drawn as a handled box. New Kingdom tomb paintings show deities gripping small bags whose contents are never explained. Some researchers have even pointed to cylinder seal impressions from Sumeria itself centuries before Ashurnapal alongside carvings of rabbits and birds, and in at least 2 other instances at the site, showing similar handled containers and processions of minor deities in attendance. Evidence, they argue, that this wasn't a late Assyrian invention at all, but an image with deep tangled roots reaching back into the earliest layers of Mesopotamian religion. Some point further afield still to South and Southeast Asian traditions where a handled ritual vessel called a kalasha, a pot topped with sacred contents, sometimes depicted with a stylized handle or crown, is carried in temple processions to this day, said to hold water charged with divine presence. It is a different object from a different tradition entirely, but the underlying grammar is oddly familiar. A container, a handle, a god, and something inside worth protecting. A Turkish pillar from before farming, an Assyrian palace wall, Anshu, a Polynesian myth of baskets falling from the sky, an Egyptian symbol for the house of the divine running through all of it. A handled container tied again and again to gods, sacred knowledge, and the boundary between the human world and something above it. Once you've seen that sequence, it's genuinely hard to unsee. And that difficulty is exactly what gives the more spectacular explanations their power. It's worth being honest about why that pull is so strong. Humans are pattern recognition machines first and skeptics second, and a repeating silhouette stretched across continents and millennia hits something deep and old in how we're wired to notice the world. That instinct isn't a flaw. It's the same instinct that led our ancestors recognize a predator's shape in tall grass half a second faster than the person next to them. The trick is knowing when that same instinct is reading a real signal and when it's finding a shape in the clouds because it was told in advance exactly what shape to look for. The fair hearing. It's a seductive theory, and it earns that seduction honestly. It takes the pattern seriously instead of waving it away. But a good theory has to survive the question you'd rather not ask. And this one has never answered it. If a single global civilization once spanned the earth, teaching every culture the same sacred symbol, why is the handbag almost the only thing they share? Where's the common alphabet, the shared unit of measurement, the identical building technique, the matching calendar, the fingerprints? Real contact always leaves behind peoples who actually meet trade far more than one silhouette. A worldwide teaching civilization that left behind exactly one handled box and nothing else isn't a civilization. It's a shape. And shapes get reinvented constantly by people who never met for reasons that are almost embarrassingly ordinary. The hand nobody was watching. To see why, stop staring at the bag and look finally at the other hand. Because that's where this entire mystery unravels. In relief after relief across the Assyrian palace walls, the Abkalu isn't just carrying a bucket. He's reaching toward the sacred tree or toward the king with a small object pinched between his fingers, raised and angled in the exact gesture of someone about to flick liquid through the air. That object has a name. Assyrian ritual texts call it the mulu, a purifier, a sprinkler. These were not obscure references buried in a single damaged half-legal tablet. Purification rites of exactly this kind are described across a wide body of Mesopotamian ritual literature. Texts concerned with cleansing a person, a room, or a king from the influence of illness, curse, or evil omen using water, incense, and precisely the gesture carved into the stone above the sacred tree. Scholars have been able to cross-reference the images with the text for well over a century, matching the vocabulary of purification to the vocabulary of sculpture almost line for line. Pair it with the bucket, and the entire scene changes register. This isn't a god holding a mysterious container of forbidden music power. This is a priest or a spirit acting as one caught mid-ritual in a ceremony we can actually reconstruct from ununiform sources describing rites of purification, exorcism, and blessing performed in and around royal buildings. The bucket, the bandadoo, held a consecrating liquid, most likely water, possibly infused with oil or a fragrant compound. The malalu was dipped into it and shaken toward whatever was being blessed, scattering droplets. The same way a priest in a dozen later traditions, separated from Assyria by thousands of years and entirely different religions, would sprinkle holy water down a nave. Bucket in one hand, sprinkler in the other. Not an artifact of impossible technology. A purification kit for the soul of an empire frozen at the instant of use. And here's what almost nobody sharing these viral images seems to know. Several Sumerian carvings include depictions of handbag-like shaped items. The Assyrians told us what this object was. They wrote it down. The bandadoo appears in their own ritual texts. An ordinary word for an ordinary bucket. The kind of vessel a worker might use to haul mud or water on any building site in the empire. The mululu appears beside it, tied to the same gesture, the same sacred tree, the same guardians, documented and repeated across sites with the reliability of a liturgy. Because that's exactly what it was. When residue has survived inside actual excavated buckets, in some cases bronze ones pulled directly from palace ruins, it points to that same humble truth. Water deposits, plant matter, the residue of purification, not the chemistry of some lost science. Nobody had to open a magic handbag. The answer was carved on the wall the entire time in the fingers of the hand nobody bothered to follow. Why the shape keeps coming back. So, why does the same silhouette turn up at Göbekli Leap and across an ocean in Mexico if the Assyrians simply meant a bucket? The honest answer is stranger and more human than aliens. Picture the problem. You need to carry liquid without spilling it, without soaking your hands, without setting it down every few steps. There are only so many shapes that solve that. A vessel to hold the volume. A flat base so it stands upright. An arch over the top so your hand can grip and lift without touching the contents. Square body, curved handle, a shape the human hand arrives at almost the instant it decides to carry something. Different peoples, thousands of years and thousands of miles apart, kept reinventing it for the same unremarkable reason. They reinvented the pot, the needle, and the wheel. The problem was the same, and solutions to a shared problem tend to rhyme. Basket weavers on opposite sides of the planet with no possible contact independently arrived at nearly identical coiling and twining techniques. Because there are only so many ways to lock fiber into a durable container, bow and arrow technology appears independently on multiple continents. Pottery kilns converge on similar shapes because clay and fire and human need behave the same way everywhere they meet. None of this is mysterious once you stop assuming that a shared solution requires a shared teacher. Sometimes the teacher is simply the problem itself, sitting in front of every culture that ever had to solve it.